When the Oklahoma House passed a bill last week prohibiting corporal punishment for school children with disabilities, the debate began anew on whether or not it's appropriate to physically discipline any child in a school setting. Corporal punishment is still permissible in Oklahoma with parental consent. That's the topic of this week's in-depth discussion with moderator Reese Wetzel and his panel of guests.
Thank you, Rich. Today we have two guests here that can really give us some more information on this hot button issue that we're going to be covering today. Today to talk about corporal punishment, we have Representative Jim Olson with the House of Representatives. He currently serves District 2 as a Republican. And then we have Joe Dorman, Chief Executive Officer at Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing great. Wonderful to be here.
Likewise. Fantastic.
Well, thank you for being here, and let's get started. So I want to start off here with Representative Olson. You believe it is appropriate to allow corporal punishment in schools. Why?
Okay, thank you for the question. Let me start big and then zero down. Let me start with the Founding Fathers. I agree with their presuppositions. They believed that there is a God. They also believed that God has communicated with men in the book called the Bible. So starting from there, we look at the Bible, and the Bible is crystal clear that this is appropriate for a child willfully, knowingly doing wrong. And as we approach the Bible, we have to be very careful we don't fall for the shallow, cheap theology of the day that says, well, I like these verses in the Bible, but these other ones I want to pull out. There are many things that go into child training, affection, teaching, other things, but also at times corporal punishment. This should start first and primarily in the home, but the school, as a delegated authority, can and should at appropriate times use corporal punishment. The Supreme Court doctrine is in loco parentis, in other words, in place of the parents. And so, one reference I'll quickly give says, now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. But afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them that are exercised thereby. So yes, I am in favor of it, and at the appropriate times.
And just real quick, what verse is that in the Bible that you just quoted right there?
That would be Hebrews 12:11 that I just quoted.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to turn to you, Joe. We have some different opinions here. You have kind of the opposite of the aisle viewpoint. Can you tell us a little bit about why you feel that way?
Absolutely, and I would disagree with the representative. I don't feel the Bible does address spanking children or using corporal punishment. When you look at the scripture that was quoted as far as using a rod to discipline children, you have to look back at the biblical context. The rod was an instrument used by shepherds to guide sheep, and the shepherds never struck their sheep. It was meant as a way to use that discipline under the teaching of the Bible, not actually physical harm. You look at Ephesians 6:4, it says for fathers not to take anger and strike their children, but instead guide them in the discipline of the Lord. So I think the Bible is clear that you should not use corporal punishment or discipline. You also have to look at the scientific data that's there to show what the impact is. Oklahoma has about 23% of our children in the state who have faced adverse childhood experiences, that long-term toxic trauma that impacts them. Many of these points that are used as far as physical harm often are passed on generation to generation. There's one story about a parent who said that when she was paddling her 3-year-old, she caught the 3-year-old paddling the 1-year-old later on because it was a learned behavior. So any type of discipline has to come with instruction and that guidance. And we certainly want to see that guidance, the appropriate punishment, community service, working things off, rather than physical harm.
Okay. And Representative Olson, I want to go back to you here. Initially, House Bill 1028 failed in the House, and how did you vote on that bill?
I voted against that bill and debated against it. It was a very well-intentioned bill, in my judgment, but also an ill-conceived bill. There is, now on the face of it, it sounds great. We're not going to paddle disabled children. Sounds like we all ought to agree with that, but there's disabled and there's disabled. There's disabled on the one hand somebody wheelchair bound, perhaps with a very low IQ that really can't understand what's being expected of them. Then on the other hand, you have very mild cases. You could have a young man as big and strong as any of us at this table.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.
And perhaps highly intelligent, but he has a speech impediment. He can't say his R's correctly. Now, on the former, I don't think anybody would advocate we need to paddle that tragic person in that tragic situation. On the latter, I don't think we want to take it off the table. And so the bill came back, amended, said, okay, it's going to refer to, I believe it was severely cognitively disabled. When it came back, I voted for it.
Okay, well, that brings up a good point. What about children maybe who just have attention disorders, or they can't be controlled because they have, ADHD? How do you feel that fits in that perspective? Does that consider disabled? Would you still consider that to be a disabled child?
So when we're working on this bill, you start with a point and then you negotiate down to hopefully something that's reasonable. I know there are amendments being drawn up right now to hopefully address that. Some of the House leadership expressed concerns about children with dyslexia, that they should not fall into this category. The language that's in the law right now was for the most severe conditions. It didn't address some of those other conditions that certainly should, in our minds, qualify for this, for children with cerebral palsy or autism, other issues that need to be addressed through legislation. So we're hoping this amendment will address some of those concerns, and the intention is to not let perfect be the enemy of good. We want to try and get something in place, just like the representative said, address those children who really don't have a voice, don't have the capability of understanding, try and come up with the appropriate discipline, but certainly take corporal punishment off the table for those children. We had about, I think it's a ballpark, about 60 school districts in the state still use corporal punishment. There were about 450 cases of corporal punishment used against children that would qualify as neurodiverse or special needs. And so we certainly want to look at that. The current language would only address about 10% of kids by estimate under IDEA. It needs to be more than that, in my opinion. Hopefully we'll find that middle ground where at least a majority of the votes in the legislature will be happy.
Yeah. And Representative Olson here, I want to talk about, you on the floor when House Bill 1028 was being discussed, you brought up the Bible verse that we had talked about earlier about the rod. So do you believe that specific verses and that the Bible should be a foundation for legislation?
Absolutely. Our founding fathers, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, there were 57 of them, if I remember correctly, more than half were graduates of a Bible school or seminary. They so frequently referred to the Bible, it was just a normal part of their life in a way that it's not so much a part of our lives these days, but they did it all the time. And you look at their correspondence, nearly 1/3 of their correspondence was some sort of biblical quotation or reference. And so the Constitution was built on the foundation of the Bible. Blackstone's Law Dictionary is another foundational document for our whole system. That was an attempt to codify in law what the Bible enjoined. So if the Bible is not going to be our guide, what's going to be our guide? The Communist Manifesto, the Humanist Manifesto. Ultimately, we have to have an anchor, a foundation. And for Western civilization, it has ultimately, at its roots, been the Bible.
Well, critics might say that that's a separation of church and state. What is your response to that? Do you believe that you're still abiding by separation of church and state when you do that?
Yes, when you consider the original context of where that phrase came from. There were Baptist folks in Rhode Island that wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. They were concerned that our country was going to decide, okay, we're the United States of America, so just like if you're Scandinavian, you're Lutheran. If you're Scottish, you're Presbyterian. If you're English, you're Anglican, etc. And so the United States is going to be whatever, the favored denomination. And his answer to them was, no, we are absolutely not going to choose in particular what kind of church you go to. So in that sense, there's separation of church and state. But as far as separating godly principles from the discourse and dialogue of the day, that is an absolute misuse of the phrase separation of church and state.
Well, Joe, that brings up an interesting point. We're talking about religion, and mostly religion now is, I would say that it's in public schools and that it could be a parental choice. How do you feel that, do you think that it does fall under parental choice for religious teachings to be brought into public schools?
Every individual is going to be governed by their own religious principles, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Jewish. They're going to have those founding core beliefs in their system, and many of them mirror each other in most of the main religions. And so individuals from an early age, if they attend some form of religious worship, it's going to impact them. Part of the separation with church and state, I agree with some of the points the representative said, we just have to make sure that the state is not out promoting specific religious beliefs. To have those core concepts, a lot of them, our system of law is based on principles that come from the Bible. And you have to look at the laws of Moses versus the teachings of Jesus and how that's adapted. We've grown a lot. There are 15 different places in the Bible where it talks about stoning women. We no longer do that in society. So we've adapted through the years to apply principles for a just system of law, and we have to make sure that that's also applied in the schools. We don't want to promote one specific religion, but we do want to make sure people are raised with core principles and are good human beings.
Yeah, and with that, how do you feel, Oklahoma is one of 19 states where corporal punishment is allowed. Do you feel like we should begin phasing that out?
I think it's going to happen at some point. I know that was a debate that was brought up on the floor about, was this just the toe under the door to try and move it towards that? Who knows what's going to happen? The reality in Oklahoma is we know that parents use corporal punishment. These schools that are using it are still probably going to use it until a law is passed. We have to look at those different views from the 149 lawmakers, the actions of the governor, and just try and come up with the best policy possible. I personally believe there are better avenues for discipline than corporal punishment, but the law is the law in Oklahoma. Until the lawmakers decide different, that's what's going to happen.
Okay. And Representative Olson, let's talk about the ways parents can get more involved. What's a way that a parent can get more involved with the school to try and help correct child behavior?
Well, I think that would entail communication with the teacher, and obviously, and I'm sure my colleague here would agree with me, it's a bad thing if parents fall into the default opinion that the teacher's wrong and my child is right. I think the default should be the teacher is almost certainly correct, and what did you do to violate his or her law? So communication with the school, finding out what good principles that they are putting forth and supporting them, working with them, and then if there are any concerns, raising them with the school if there are.
So at what point do you feel that corporal punishment would be involved if a child's still not behaving? Like at what point do you draw that line? Do you try other practices first, such as like detention, or do you prefer to go corporal punishment first?
You know, that would vary. In a family situation, in my judgment, it's going to be a little bit more direct. Once you've been given clear instruction and you've willfully disobeyed, it would be applied. Now in a public school, even those that use it do not use it that strictly. It's closer to a last resort, and that's fine. It can still have some effectiveness if used to that degree, but I will refer to a colleague of mine, Representative Randleman, who also initially debated against House Bill 1028. He said 92% of children can be motivated by positive motivation. 8% cannot. Out of that 8%, 7% need that discipline of some kind of corporal punishment. And if I can briefly, I'll circle back to the point about what the rod is, and I have seen that interpretation before. I'm going to respectfully disagree. It's a broad word that can include the meaning that was quoted, but the scripture does, elsewhere in Proverbs, says, "Let not thy soul spare for his crying." So I don't think it was, in that case, a gentle guidance. I think it was physical discipline.
Okay, and Joe, we're running short on time here, so I'm going to just give you a response to that if you would like to respond to that.
Certainly. The lawmaker, Representative Randleman, mentioned that of the 101 members that were on the floor, maybe one of them would need some kind of corporal punishment. So there are different interpretations. You have different professional opinions. With this, I certainly believe, I think the science backs it up, I think Christianity backs it up, that there are better ways to discipline children.
Well, I would like to thank you, Joe Dorman, Chief Executive Officer at the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy, and Representative Jim Olson, House of Representatives, serving District 2. Thank you both for your time and your insight on this topic.
Yes, sir. Thank you.